What's the plan?
And we're trying to get everything consolidated and get a cohesive set of questions to ask you.
Roger, 15, we copy.
That sounds real good. Appreciate it.
Anything else to report?
Right, we haven't talked about landing for several days.
Believe none of what you hear, question everything you see. That's affirmative. That's affirmative.
Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Now, I know people will want me to cover the situation in the Middle East. I would advise that if you haven't seen it, watch show number 277, which, even though it was recorded over 6 years ago, sets out the entire background to the current Middle East conflict and pretty much predicts what is happening now. I do intend to cover the issue as part of a future show. Now, it's some time since I have given an update on my legal situation, so I will give a very brief recap of the entire saga now and then bring you up to date on what is happening. In 2020, I published a book and some films reporting on my detailed independent investigation into the 2017 Manchester Arena incident. As part of my reporting, I expressed opinions based on the evidence detailing what I believe took place, which was contrary to the official narrative which had been put out by the government and the media. In late 2022, the mainstream media ran an extensive smear campaign against me in relation to my investigative activities and published work. In early 2023, legal action was launched against me in order to seek an injunction and damages which would effectively censor certain things that I reported. In January 2024, before the trial took place, the High Court made a judgment which meant that all of the evidence I intended to present to the court in my defence was to be excluded from the upcoming trial. A 4-day trial took place in July 2024, and in October 2024 a judgment was made against me for harassment. As a result of this judgment, an injunction was imposed and costs and damages are now being sought, totalling some £279,000. In July 2025, a statutory demand for the money was issued, and following this, a court hearing was held in August 2025. At this hearing, I intended to present legal arguments as to why any bankruptcy proceedings should be delayed until my case has been considered by the European Court of Human Rights. I was informed in multiple letters from the court that the hearing was a directions hearing, which simply sets a date, a location, and gives directions for the future hearing. However, when I attended the hearing with my barrister, the judge informed me that this was the actual hearing, not just the directions hearing. I had been given no notice whatsoever that it was an actual hearing, therefore had not prepared a proper statement nor submitted any evidence to the court. And it appears that the other side had been informed because they submitted their skeleton argument before the hearing took place. Now, following this hearing, a bankruptcy hearing was held in January 2026. I represented myself at that hearing and presented arguments to try and persuade the court to delay the bankruptcy proceedings until the European Court has considered my appeal against the original judgments. The judge requested that I put these arguments in writing and ordered another hearing a week later. That hearing took place on the 23rd of January 2026, where I presented my arguments to try and stay the bankruptcy proceedings. The judge did not make a ruling and referred the case to another court, which was the Business and Property Court in Cardiff, for a hearing which is scheduled for the 8th of May 2026. Now, every ruling against me by the UK courts has been appealed by me every step of the way. And in May 2025, I had exhausted every avenue in the UK courts to appeal the judgments. So, on the 25th of September 2025, which is within the 4 months time limit, I submitted an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. The appeal sets out 12 separate occurrences where my human rights were violated by the judgments. 2 violations of Article 10, which is the right to freedom of expression, and 10 violations of Article 6, which is the right to a fair trial. I am seeking for the ECHR to request a retrial in which my evidence can actually be heard and thus ultimately overturn the judgment. The appeal contains a considerable amount of European case law involving cases where journalists in similar situations to myself have had their judgments overturned as a result of appealing to the ECHR. It could take up to 3 years before the ECHR considers my case. So my current situation is that I have a bankruptcy hearing on the 8th of May, which will decide whether or not to delay the bankruptcy proceedings until after my ECHR appeal is heard, or make me bankrupt on or shortly after the 8th of May. Now, if bankruptcy proceeds, it means my assets will no longer be safe, including my home, where I live with my 10-year-old son, Lewis. In order to mitigate any consequences for my son losing his family home, Andrew Johnson and others have set up a trust fund for Lewis called A Home for Lewis. And I'm joined by Andrew now, and would like to thank you, Andrew, for doing what you've done to help my son Lewis to mitigate the loss of his home, if indeed that is what happens. So, yeah, would you like to just...
Yeah, well, I think equally I'd like to thank those that have donated to the trust. Obviously, the situation that you're in has been very difficult and stressful, and so I think it's only right that there should be some sort of safety net to try and mitigate some of the effects of any potential bankruptcy. And of course, that's what the trust is for. And I think for the totality of funds that are in there at this time is around about 15,000. So that's been a massively generous set of donations from various people. Too many to list or name here, but thank you to those that have donated. It's a very generous set of donations that have come in. So yeah, it's been great. So thank you to everyone.
All right, thanks for that, Andrew. Now, those who have been following Rich Planet Power series, I'm going to give a brief update on that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please watch show numbers 314, 315 and 316. And thank you to the viewer, anonymous viewer, who sent me this. It's obviously a shitty hoodie with the words Rich Planet Power, Chief Engineer. Now, there is only one engineer, so I guess that makes me the chief. Now, that hoodie's too small for me, so I've given it to my son Lewis, and here he is. Okay, so thank you very much to whoever sent that, and for all of the other letters that I've had recently. Thank you. Now, I have carried out some further tests on the N machine since the last program, and these tests probably mean that my initial hypothesis may be incorrect. So I am in the process of deriving a new hypothesis which will require further tests. Now, in order to conduct further tests, I've bought one of these. Just see it there. Now that, we'll give a close-up of it, that is a torque sensor. Now, for those who've been following the series, this goes in between the motor and the generator. Because the motor which drives the generator is on a shaft. Okay, now that shaft, when mechanical power is being transmitted to the generator, that shaft is under constant torque, right? So if you imagine that pen and I twist it that way and I twist it the other way, I'm producing a torque on that object, right? A twisting force. Now the shaft in the N machine is under a torque all the time that is running. And that mechanical power is being fed in. Now, what this device does, you put it in between the motor and the generator, and that will measure how much torque is on the shaft. Now, the power going through the shaft is equal to the torque times the speed, times the RPM. And you see a little readout there. Now, this device measures extremely accurately, and it takes samples very, very quickly of the torque, and it also measures the speed. So you get an exact power reading of how much mechanical power is being fed into the generator. Now, what that means is I don't need to measure the power going into the electrical generator, because that generator has losses, which I'm not exactly sure what those losses are, and you need to make a calculation to take account of those losses. So I don't need to bother with all that. This will also give a much more accurate reading, because if you noticed some of the graphs of the input power, the dots or the points on the graph were not always lining up. This should give me a perfect curve and tell me the exact input power. So this will give me a far more accurate reading. The other thing this will do, it will allow me to use the variable speed motor. The reason why I didn't use the variable speed motor is I don't know what the efficiency rating of it is. So I don't know what the exact power going in is. Therefore, this will allow me to run the thing at lots of different speeds and perhaps develop an equation which takes into account the speed, because I think this anomaly that I've documented, where we seem to be getting extra power out, may be related in some way to the speed. Okay, so yeah, I've got to make a modification to the end machine, so it's going to be that much bigger, because this needs to be incorporated into the shaft, and then do further testing. All right. Now, obviously, energy is a very important issue in today's world, as we know, with regards to availability of oil. I heard Liz Truss in an interview the other day. She pointed out that China are still building coal-fired power stations, and with that power, they're making solar panels, and they're selling those solar panels to the UK market en masse, so that we can solve the climate change problem, which I thought, you know, a great comment from Liz Truss there. And I think she is now an interesting person to listen to, and she seems to be speaking more freely about the problems in government than she would have when she was in office, but enough of her. And now on to the subject of today's show, which is a discussion about an amazing new book called Exploring Consciousness, Expanding Reality by Andrew Johnson. Now, in this book, we will consider a range of evidence that shows that our consciousness does not always reside in our physical body. What does science have to say about our consciousness? What experiments have been done which show that our consciousness extends beyond or even exists outside of our physical body? We will look at the testimony of people who have had near-death experiences, and we will consider their meaning. Have some people experienced a life before life about which they can recall specific, verifiable details? What do religions have to say about such experiences? Why is the use of psychedelics, that's drugs, frowned upon and even suppressed and criminalized in Western cultures? Have off-world beings or entities communicated with some people in an effort to show them the true nature of our being or our consciousness? Looking at the research of people such as Dr. Rick Strassman, Graham Hancock, Anthony Peake, and Dr. Gary Schwartz, this book attempts to draw together diverse threads in an effort to find common ground between science, religion, mysticism, and spirituality. It is hoped that the exploration of aspects of human consciousness discussed in this book will encourage the reader to expand their view of what reality is and begin or continue their spiritual journey. So this is a little bit of a diversion from our usual topics, Andrew. And one thing I liked was the fact that you're not ruling anything out. You're considering all areas. So you just want to mention that.
Yeah, so that, you know, this is really kind of a synthesis of and a kind of joining of various paths that I've been on. Obviously, some of those things we've discussed at quite some length, Richard, over the years. And I suppose this is kind of something of a culmination of those things, where you start to explore areas which take you outside the normal everyday thinking that you would, you know, in your old life, if you will, encounter. And so, you know, I've been interested in most of these topics for a long time, particularly things like near-death experience, which I think are a good crossover between aspects of science and aspects of spirituality and aspects of religion. That's one of the key areas for me that where, you know, we'll talk about a bit more later on. And so really it's to try and get people to look at a larger picture of reality, as kind of it says in the title, really, and sort of nudge them along various paths in that direction, and it will encompass things like aliens and ghosts and psychic phenomena and all those kinds of things, really.
Right. Well, we'll come on to all of that. Now, before we get started and going through Andrew's book, because we are going to go through it in quite some detail, I just want to set out a few things which comes from the science area about space, matter and time and what they are, because I think it ties in to the work in this new book, and it might give people an understanding of how to link what you're saying in this book perhaps more to real scientific principles. So space first, and I don't mean outer space. Where Andrew's sitting and where I'm sitting, there is space between us. Now, people would often think that there's nothing there. Now, if we were in a vacuum where all of the gas in the room was taken out and we were sitting looking at each other, there's nothing there. There is space there, right, which has properties. So if I were to get a torch and shine it through the vacuum at Andrew, he'd be able to see the light. Now that light is vibrating at a particular frequency. We know that. We know visible what the frequency of light vibrates at, and it's propagating through the medium of space. So it's disturbing space by making the space carry a wave at the speed of light to Andrew. So that thing called space has properties, right? It is a thing, even though there's apparently nothing there because we can't see it. Now, I just want you to consider that space, because there's not just visible light. We've got radio signals, we've got 5G, we've got 4G, we've got thousands of different frequencies. So in the space between me and Andrew at this moment, there is just an immense amount of data gushing through that space that we can't see. Now, anything that is a wave and is propagated requires the medium to be elastic. So it has to go into one sort of configuration and then return. So it's a wobble, it's a vibration, it's something going through there. Now, space must be almost infinitely elastic in order to be able to transmit frequencies from, let's just say, 1 megahertz, which is a medium band or AM radio. Now that vibrates at 1 million cycles a second. That's how fast the space is vibrating when it's carrying that wave. 5G, 50 billion cycles a second. That's what 5G is, right? Now, as Rupert Sheldrake said, and we're going to come on to it, space is a tricky concept in modern day physics, because many people think there are more than just the 3 dimensions. So there's more going on in space than just our 3 dimensions. Now, light has a frequency of 500 terahertz, which is 500,000 billion cycles per second. So that's way above 5G. And there are people such as Nassim Haramein who go further and argue that empty space actually has a structure, a bit like invisible scaffolding, you might say, or a lattice of some kind, and that has a shape within it, which is a whole array of spheres which are fractal. Now, a fractal structure is something where you go inside that sphere and then there's another sphere and then there's another sphere, and it goes on forever, getting infinitely smaller.
Like a Russian doll, yeah.
Yeah, and I think his model is also based on a 64 tetrahedron grid which forms these spheres. That's what he says the structure of space is, and who knows, he may be right. Now, another scientist who, if you go back and watch show number 7, a very early show that I did, I had a guy on called John Duffield, and he brought my attention to a scientific paper which was entitled, "Is the Electron a Photon with Toroidal Topology?" Now, let me just explain that and why I'm bringing it up. Because everyone agrees, or it's accepted in physics, that light has no mass. It's not a thing, it's not matter, it is a wave. But an electron does have mass. So this is a thing, it is matter, like a proton. A proton is heavier, but an electron is the lightest particle, right, that exists. So we can say that is, quote unquote, stuff. Now, this paper is suggesting, and I think it may well be right, that that electron is in fact just a photon which has been caught up in an endless loop or knot. And the photon, which is just a light wave, a wave of light, which has no mass, basically gets trapped, and it continues in an endless loop. And that is what an electron is. So there we have the boundary between matter and energy. So the amount of energy in there would be, follow Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. The energy in there is equal to the mass times the speed of light squared. The mass of an electron is not contested. It's 9.109 times 10 to the minus 3 kilograms, okay?
10 to the minus 31.
31, well done, Andrew, yeah. Now, if the electron is a photon with toroidal topology, right, we can work out what the frequency of it is, right, using Planck's constant. So we can use Planck's equation, which gives you the energy in an electromagnetic wave, E equals hf, so where f is the frequency, right? So if we rearrange that equation, we get f equals E over h. So in other words, the frequency of the photon that is making that electron would be 1.3 times 10 to the power 20 hertz, which is about a gamma ray frequency. And we know that gamma rays appear in nuclear reactions when particles are made and when they're destroyed. So this all makes sense to me, that all matter is essentially, you could describe it as trapped light. So it is light which has somehow become tied up in an endless loop, and Duffield goes into the different shapes of the various particles. So the proton is also a photon which is in an endless loop, but it's a different shape loop and it's much tighter. So there's a lot more energy and a lot more mass in a proton. And he goes through the various subatomic particles, arguing that they are all just light. Okay. Now, if we accept that physical matter is just energy in the form of a wave, but it's been put into a loop. And the interesting thing about an electron is that it always has the same charge and the same mass. And this is the quantization effect that we talk about in quantum physics. It's always the same size. You know, it doesn't gradually get bigger or smaller. It's not a variable thing. It has to be that size. So that's one unit of mass, which is a quantum. That's why it's called quantum physics. Now, if you think about it, if you take an infinitely small piece of time and you look at that photon, which is described, that photon has to get all the way around and do one circuit in order for that thing to exist, right? Now, we're talking about a very short piece of time here. Now, if you were to do an even shorter piece of time so that photon hadn't got all the way around to describe the electron, then the electron doesn't exist. So if you consider that particle for a short enough time period, it's not there. It's only there once it's done one complete loop, right? So what this is saying is that matter requires time or motion to exist. It can't exist without time or space. Now, in what we're going to talk about, which is the non-physical world, so what I'm suggesting here is that the physical world fundamentally has to have motion or time. Now, the two are different, right? I'll just go into that. I'll go into that in a minute. But if you often hear people say that souls they're eternal, because we can assume that the soul is non-physical. People say that the soul isn't physical. Well, if it's not physical, then it doesn't need time and space to exist. You have to have time and that space to make that disturbance, to create stuff, right? So if something's outside of the physical, it doesn't need time to exist or to be. So it's just in a different realm which doesn't need time in order to be. So therefore, to someone who's in a time or emotion-based world, it seems eternal, but it's not necessarily. It's just in a different realm which doesn't require space and time. Now, some people would say, well, that doesn't exist because there's nothing there. And that's what we're going to move on to and discuss. Is it there? Is there something there which is real, which is part of our reality, that doesn't require space or time, or one of those two? And just to mention time, right? This is just one more concept I want to try and explain before we move on, because this is also relevant. Now, as I mentioned, I believe that all of your atoms are essentially a vibration of a photon locked in a loop. Now that has a clock rate, so it'll go around it'll describe that a particle once. Let's say it's once a second. It's much quicker than that, but let's say it's once a second. So all your atoms they've got a clock rate of once a second, right? Once a second, once a second. Now, if I speed up time so that those atoms are moving twice the speed, you've got no perception of that. In other words, your perception of time is based on one passage of that light through that one cycle. Do you see what I mean? So you could increase time by 100 times, right? So in other words, those atoms are moving 100 times faster, but you still perceive one cycle as 1 second. So what that means is we don't actually have any absolute perception of time. We don't really perceive it properly, right? Because if you've got a clock and you speed up time, all of the atoms in the clock speed up and all of your atoms speed up and the clock's just going at the same speed, right? So we don't actually have a perception of time. So you think, well, and this is the difference between time and motion, because what we perceive as motion, we can't perceive time, we perceive motion, because the time can change, and we perceive 1 second as the amount of time that particle takes to get round. Now, just going back to the properties of space, which I just mentioned, that the amount of information that space can actually contain going from one place to another, is it not equally possible that you can have that information in one place? That it's not being transmitted by a radio transmitter that you're receiving, etc. That there's a static form of information which would be known as the akashic. It's just that we haven't built technology to be able to both program it and read from it, but it's there in our actual long-term memory, which we're going to come on to, is able to access it, right? So there's just a few pointers there that perhaps, you know, people can think about, which is sort of based in science, right? Which I think will possibly give more credence to what we're going to discuss. And because I was thinking about those concepts when I was reading your book, Andrew. Okay. We're going to start off with a quote from Max Planck, who was a scientist. We just mentioned Planck's constant.
We did,
there.
yeah.
And he said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derived from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." And you then go on to discuss Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about memory and where long-term memory is stored, not other types of memory. So do you want to make any comments on what I've said already, Andrew?
So I agree with you. I think it's the whole idea of time is very important in terms of considering what consciousness is, and the way that you describe the sort of interwoven, how time's interwoven with matter, essentially. That's a very interesting. I've not heard of it described like that before. I've heard similar things, but not that particular way of describing it. And I think when we do get to talking about the timelessness, yes, it does, like you were saying about the timelessness of the soul and stuff, it does tie into that, yeah. And
it ties into Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, because
absolutely.
If you take an infinitely slim amount of time, let's describe it differently. Let's say that electron is moving, right? And it's actually, that electron is actually a wave going round in a loop, right? Because that electron isn't just a solid object, it's impossible to define where it is, because it's a dynamic thing inside it. That's what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is getting at.
Yeah.
That you cannot. Where is it now?
You can't measure the position and the speed, both with infinite accuracy. If you measure one more accurately, the other has to be measured less accurately, and that's where the time comes in, because you're using a shorter and shorter time. If you want to measure the speed more accurately.
The other thing, just before we move on as well, is that you hear people say, well, the matter, life is just a hologram, just an illusion. And it kind of explains that, in that matter is just a wave, which is energy trapped. Is it being projected from the place where our consciousness, the timeless consciousness that I was talking about, where you know, it doesn't require time to be. Is it a projection? Because when you look at it on that level, that it is just a wave in a loop, then it kind of has that feeling. I know I'm not being very scientific in my language here. Right, so I've got a quote from Rupert Sheldrake from Andrew's book here. It says, "For some mysterious reason, consciousness has emerged in brains, and especially human brains, and animals have some. But we've got more than anyone else." I think he's maybe being a little bit sarcastic there. "This leads to the idea we live in an unconscious, purposeless universe, and we're the only conscious beings in it, or the only ones that matter. It means we can do what we like. It gives us a sense of enormous power over nature, and we can do what we like with the earth." So you say here, does observing events change the outcome? And does consciousness create reality? All right. And you say here that the function of cells is not necessarily controlled just by our DNA, evidence of outside control, epigenetics, environmental origins. Do you want to make any comments on any of that?
Yeah, so this, I mean, there's a bit of context to all of that. So the quote from Sheldrake really was, he was trying to show how mainstream science views consciousness, and it kind of does accept consciousness as an idea, but then he goes on to, they just sort of talk about human consciousness being more advanced than animal consciousness, and therefore that gives us, this ability to sort of to run the planet, as it were, and then so that kind of impinges on the attitude of science to the study of consciousness itself. That's kind of what he's talking about.
So the concept that we create our own reality is an interesting one. Now that doesn't necessarily mean there's something coming from another timeless realm where our soul resides, but perhaps there is. But just look out your window and look at all of the buildings, all of the roads, computers, everything in a town or a city. All of those things started at some point in somebody's mind before they were built. Yeah, at some point they were designed, they were thought about. Every road, every car, everything. So everything in the modern world has come from thought or from consciousness. But we could also argue, Andrew, that even life comes from consciousness. So you've got a quote there.
Yes, so Rick Clay was talking about the creation of, he talked about mind before matter and how consciousness creates matter. And he said, I don't mean to be crude about this, but when, for instance, a man is sleeping and he has an orgasm in the middle of the night, the process has created that is not any physical action. It's all stemmed from thought. And so if you think about that, then obviously that thought has then created the ability to create life. That for me is proof that everything is a mind before matter universe. You can create life with thought. So that means that everything that you're looking at essentially is consciousness.
Now, evidence which suggests that there is another realm that we're not aware of comes from, as you mentioned, Rupert Sheldrake and his morphic fields. But in particular, the study of animal and human memory. Because I'm of the opinion, I agree with Rupert Sheldrake, that long-term memories are not held in the grey matter of your head. Let me just explain a little bit, because I'm going to show a clip of Rupert Sheldrake when I interviewed him. I think it was 2010. So if I put that cup there and I look over there, I can remember where the cup is and put my hand on it, right? Now that, remembering where that cup is, right, is stored in the frontal lobe, that short-term memory. They've proved that. If you were to cut that out, I wouldn't know where it was. I'd forget where I'm putting it, right? That's where it's been stored. Habit memory is in the cerebellum, in the back. So remembering how to drive your car, which you just do automatically, that's coming from here, and they've proved that, right? But if I try and remember who taught me physics in 1986 or 1985, right, and remember his name, they cannot pin down where that memory is coming from. All right, they know that when you're formulating a long-term memory, it goes to this place called the hippocampus, because they've measured the electrical activity in the brain, and then once you move on to another memory, it goes from there, and they don't know where it goes, and they don't know where it's been retrieved from. So it's as if the whole brain is then a receiver from some unknown place to that memory. So yeah, just show this clip with Rupert Sheldrake.
Now, one of the statements that you use, which seemed to it sort of rang true with me, if you like, was that do minds reach out from brains, which is kind of what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yes.
I've done a little bit of reading on where things are stored in the brain, and nobody seems to really have a clue how long-term memory works.
That's true.
I think that I don't believe that long-term memory is stored in the physical grey matter of our neurons, in our neural networks.
Nor do I.
So that the brain is, for long-term memory at least, is an interfacing device.
Yes. Well, what I'm saying is that personally, I think brains are overrated. I think people assume that all the memories are stored inside the head, and they think that all our minds are confined to the inside of our head. And I don't think that's true. I think the brain's more like a tuning device, a bit more like a TV set or a mobile phone that tunes into influences coming from elsewhere. I think the memories, things that we resonate with, I think we have a collective memory. We tune into lots of other people in the past. But we tune into ourselves as well by the same kind of process, only we tune into ourselves more specifically because we're more similar to ourselves in the past than anyone else. That's why we get our own memories, not other people's. And so I think the brain's like a tuning system. The memories are not stored inside the brain. We resonate with ourselves in the past. When you go to a familiar place or meet a familiar person, when your nerve cells stimulate your eyes and senses stimulate the brain cells, they resonate with the same kinds of patterns when you saw that person before, and you remember it all by resonance. So the memory is not inside the brain, according to this theory.
All right. And does that describe what you would term the Akashic record, or is that another complete theory altogether? Because people say that.
Yes. Well, the Akashic record is an attempt to get at the same kind of idea. You see, in the 19th century, theosophists who were English people interested in Eastern philosophy, most of them were English, and they were out in India, they read up on Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. And in Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, there's the idea there's a kind of memory in nature. It's more or less what I'm saying. And they came up with the idea, the theosophists, of the Akashic records. Akash is the Indian word for space or ether. And so they had the idea that these records in space of what's happened in the past. I'm saying something very similar. There's a cosmic memory, the laws of nature are more like habits. But you see, the Akashic record uses a metaphor that I wouldn't use. Record implies something like a filing cabinet or a CD or a tape recording or something. The word record, because we think of it in terms of books or filing systems, implies some physical store somewhere in space. Now, I don't think that's how it works. I think it works by resonance across time. And you can resonate, if you remember what you did yesterday, you resonate with yourself yesterday, but in between yesterday and today, it's not as if all that information has been stored in a static form somewhere outside space and time in a cosmic filing cabinet or something, or a cosmic hard drive. It's a direct resonance across time. So the idea of Akashic records is basically saying the same thing as a cosmic memory, but it's using a metaphor that I don't think is appropriate. I use a different one, resonance.
Right. I was very intrigued by the fact that your long-term memory may well be somewhere outside of your neural network, shall we say. And let me just explain this to you. Your short-term memory, they say, is in your frontal lobe. You know, if you're making a cup of tea, you remember where you've put the teacup. And your habit type memory, so to remember how you drive a car, is I think in the cerebellum. So these are fairly well understood. But your long-term memory, where you're remembering, say, things from your childhood, they say that there's the part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is used in formulating those long-term memories.
Yes.
But they somehow end up somewhere else in the brain, but no one
Yes.
seems to know how they get from this hippocampus to elsewhere in the brain.
Yes.
Now, I thought, well, possibly the hippocampus is pushing out the memory into some other space or some other dimension, and that the rest of the brain is then a receiver to that at some other point in time. Now, I then looked into what research had been done on this thing called the hippocampus, and over the last 5 years, scientists have done quite a lot of research into rat hippocampus.
Yes.
Now, what they've found is that certain cells inside the rat hippocampus are called grid cells, and the reason why they call them that, if they put a little device on the cell to measure its electrical activity, and they just let the rat wander around a room, it basically they will get an increase in voltage at certain points in
Yes.
space, and it what it does is it maps out this grid. So if it was to walk around the room for several hours, the grid cells are triggered at these points,
Yes.
and it maps out a perfect hexagonal triangular grid system.
Yes.
Now, what the scientists say is the reason why the purpose for that is for its navigation to get
Yes.
from A to B. Now I think you see your navigation is done by another part of the brain. I can't remember what it is, but it's not necessarily the hippocampus. And there was this guy called Henry Mollison, and he had both his hippocampus removed, and they were non-functioning, and he didn't lose any of his spatial awareness. Okay, so you would by this argument you would say, well, he should have lost all of his spatial awareness. Now, but what this guy did, he lost his ability to create long-term memory, so he couldn't remember what he'd done a week ago. Okay,
Yes.
because his hippocampus wasn't formulating those memories.
Yes.
But he could remember what he did 5 years ago because his hippocampus was working at that point in time. You see,
Yes.
because it had formulated the memory. So the other thing about the hippocampus is, I'm an electrical engineer. It's packed full of zinc. And zinc is the only metal which has negative resistance. So you can actually make a radio transmitter out of a piece of zinc. So I'm thinking that this grid is actually the mechanism that it's using to tap into the space. You know what I mean? That these are
Yes.
maybe access points to where the memory is being stored, perhaps. And but every science paper that I read, this is to do with spatial awareness, this grid. So I just wanted to...
Oh yes, well I know, I've been tracking this literature too. I think what my reading of it was this, that in order to build up a memory, you've got to associate things together. What you recall is what the associations you've made at the time. If you don't make them in the first place, you can't recall them. So like when you meet a new person, most English people are hopeless at remembering names. They're introduced to somebody and they instantly forget. Now Americans are different. You know, if I meet somebody in America, they say, "Hi, Rupert." Well, how are you today, Rupert? They keep repeating it, so they get it. And next time you meet them, they can remember your name. It's very impressive. Now the thing is, you have to create the associations to remember them. Now, what happens? The hippocampus has a kind of spatial map in it, and when you encounter something in a particular place, there's an activity in the hippocampus that links it to the sights and smells and things, all the other aspects of that thing. They all get linked together, and the hippocampus seems to be the place that links them together to create this resonant pattern inside the brain. It's a kind of resonant pattern of activity. Now, what happens then is that they've mapped all that, they've shown it happens and stuff, brain scientists. But then after you've had that experience, you move on to some other experience. The hippocampus are creating other resonant patterns. And the first one isn't in the hippocampus anymore. So then they assume it must have been shunted off into some other part of the brain for long-term storage, which they can't find, as you rightly say. They can't find it there. I don't think it's there at all. I think it works by resonance. The hippocampus sets up a resonant pattern that links things together in a kind of spatial way. And then when you remember it, you tune into that. Now, if people lose their hippocampus, then they can't set up these new resonant patterns like this chap you mentioned. And in experiments with rats, they've found you can train rats to learn new mazes and where things are, and they need the hippocampus for that. But you can cut the hippocampus out after that, and they can still remember, which is why they say, well, the memory must be somewhere else. Well, it is somewhere else. It's not in the brain at all, in my view, rather than being in some undefined other bit of the brain.
And are there? I've heard of stories of people having their entire hemisphere removed, and they can remember almost everything. Is that?
Yes. Well, I mean, the point is, that's happened in experiments with rats. In the 30s and 40s, people were desperately trying to trace memories in the brain, and they trained rats to learn new tricks, and then cut out various bits of the brain, the right, the left, the front, the back, and stuff. And they found that when the rat had recovered from the operation, it could still remember, even after big chunks of the brain had been removed. And that's why they came to the conclusion that, as they said, memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular, because you couldn't pin it down in a particular place. And some people said, well, it must be stored holographically in the brain. A hologram is where you have a kind of photo interference pattern in a photo. And even if you cut half of a hologram off, you can still get back the same image. Each bit contains information from the whole.
Right.
So I don't think it's holographic, because that's still the theory, it's stored in the brain, but they're trying to explain the fact you can't pin it down. I'd go further, I'd say it's not in the brain at all, which is why you can't locate the exact memory stores.
And if this is the case, then, you then have this, you just philosophically speaking, what would happen if you connected to the wrong person, you connected to someone else's brain memory? So there must be some kind of umbilical cord keeping us all connected to our own memories. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I think that's similarity. You see, the umbilical cord I don't think is an actual cord. I think it's the fact you're more similar to you yesterday and last year and when you were a child than you are to me. That's why you have your own memories, because you resonate with yourself.
Right.
Now, if you had serious brain damage, an accident that disrupted your brain and changed the way it resonates, you might conceivably pick up other people's memories. And there are cases of people who have accidents who have extraordinary abilities they didn't have beforehand.
Now, and this brings us on to the question of the Akashic or the Akashic records, which is ancient texts say that there is a memory of everything that's happened. Now it seems impossible, because you've got the passage of time. How can everything be being recorded? We can't put limits on what else space might be able to do. Empty space. We've discussed it there with the radio waves, etc. We don't know that it isn't recording a lot of or everything that's going on in the world. That it isn't a blueprint for everything that's happened.
You can kind of make an analogy in certain ways, although this can easily be shot down. But you look at cloud storage now. And certainly in the digital world, we've kind of reached a situation where everything is recorded now. If you have a smartphone, it will, and you don't change the settings, much of what you record will be uploaded to the cloud. And we don't know how the cloud exactly works, and we don't know how we seem to have infinite storage capacity. But it seems, like everything has been recorded to the cloud. For like the last 12 years. But I don't operate anything in the cloud. So what if there's some equivalent of that working at the level of fundamental space? And what I was going to say when you were discussing the photon analogy is that, well, if the light is traveling through the supposed empty space, there really must be something there for that light to impinge on, for it to be transmitted. And I know that's not a scientific explanation, but empty space isn't empty, basically. And if you look at the discussion of the 0-point field and so forth, that I think ties into what you were saying about the electron loop and so forth. And so I think it's easier now. In other words, if you consider the cloud storage situation of today, it's easier for us to accept that something like the Akashic records might exist. where that's stored in free space, or whatever free space is actually made of.
I've got a quote from Andrew's book about the Akashic from Professor David Boehm, and he says that if this is correct, then the human brain has direct access to the Akashic field and the virtually limitless information that it contains. It will be recalled that the Akasha can be described as a huge digital database that stores the records of everything that has happened and will happen in the universe. In fact, if modern quantum physics is correct, then there are trillions of universes containing billions of copies of every human being that has ever lived and ever will live. Each one of these consciousnesses will download their life experiences into the Akasha via their microtubules, and similarly they can upload limitless data from the Akasha using the same process. If Hirano and Hirai are correct, then the Akashic data can be reassembled using the laser-like coherent light to create seemingly three-dimensional holographic images of the stored information. This would create in the mind of the experiencer a three-dimensional version of the recording that would be totally lifelike in every way. It would be like the illusionary world of the Matrix movies. It would be indistinguishable from the real thing. I use the speech marks because such a model suggests that the reality we take for granted, that is external to our bodies and supplied to us by our senses, may not be as real as we believe. Indeed, modern neurology tells us that what we take to be external reality is a construct of the brain modelled out of the electrochemical information supplied to it from our senses. The question is there a portal within the brain whereby the riches of the Akasha can be accessed? I believe there is, and I suggest that this portal may be the most mysterious and enigmatic structure in the brain, the pineal gland. If my hypothesis is correct, then the OOB, or out-of-body experience, can be explained by simply consciousness experiencing the external world from internally generated information. The person feels that they are outside of the body when in fact they are experiencing the hidden realities contained within the 0 point field.